that's a wonderful tree in Nassau. And, we are fortunate around the world to have these wonderful trees. And we've learned a lot more about how to grow better trees. And the research really in the last 10 years on both starting at propagation all the way to how we maintain and enjoy older trees and how we help them live longer has really evolved in the last 10 years measurably. And I'm going to really talk about pruning, really how much that can help older trees and younger trees, but it's very interesting. One thing that I like to do is when I first started learning about arboriculture and arboriculture, and 30 years ago, I was fortunate to have an instructor named Dr. Kim Coder. He's an urban forestry professor at the University of Georgia, and I took a class with him. And, he's kind of a big, chubby guy, and you're like, oh, he's going to be very, really professor-like and boring. And he started his program with, all right, you guys ready to learn something about trees? And he went on a whole day like that. So it was, that's what we're going to do today, learn a little more about trees. All right. Pericles knows where that is, the primeval forest here on the island. But here's just a quick summary of what we're going to be talking about. Some of the things are more basic, others are not. An organization I'm very involved with is this group, the International Society of Arboriculture, which is based in the U.S., but it's in 45 countries around the world. And it's the group that certifies arborists, so we'll be talking a little about that. This way, there we go. Many of us know the basics of tree science and the values of trees. And I just list out some quick items. Obviously, it's very important that we maintain forests, whether they be the pine forests of Andros or the coppice forests of Eleuthera. Pruning trees. Young trees benefit from pruning. Older trees. Trees really require 25 years to really develop strong structure. And we're going to look at that a little closer. But, understanding structural pruning and what that means can absolutely extend the life and health of trees. Landscape tree pruning. We obviously, when we look at urban trees and trees that are in our settlements and communities, starting with structural pruning where you really are pruning for strength, pruning to achieve goals. In some cases, you have fruit production trees like mangoes or lychees there are certain things that can be done to prune them to have them produce more fruit. And flower, of course, enhancement with the beautiful Roya poincianas that are in the islands. Removing all the dead limbs that can be really a hazard to urban areas, especially along walkways and driveways and roads. Addressing weak connections, we'll talk a little more about. And of course, respecting limits that, over pruning can be an abusive practice. And of course, I always throw this in just because it's the number one cause of injury with people pruning trees is electrical overhead lines. All right, the take-home message. And if you're, all of us, no matter if you're a scientist or not, if you have trees in your yard, you have, your mom's tree that you're going to help her prune, once you learn how to do good pruning cuts, it takes the same amount of time. So, as much as doing a bad pruning cut. So if you take that little bit of time to learn how to do a good pruning cut, it dramatically helps that tree. It reduces further decay in the future and just adds strength to the tree. So that's a take-home message on this. So pruning young trees, developing a central leader. That's where you're tying the top of the tree to the ground through a connection of a central leader tree. Very, very critical in structure. Identifying the lowest branch of the permanent canopy. Those branches, as they continue up, you particularly when you're needing clearance over roadways or parks, you don't want to continue the low branches that become problems that you end up having to cut off when they're big. It's better to address them when they're small. Spacing the branches along the trunk, keeping all branches less than a half-inch in diameter as you're doing pruning of smaller trees, and, of course, suppressing growth on branches that have included bark. And we're going to talk about one of the major failure points of trees. Young trees. Here's here's just some tree. We were doing some pruning on this young live oak in South Florida, and getting structure put back into that tree. Palms, that's probably the most abused pruning plant, where palms, especially in urban landscapes, are just over-pruned. Many times they're over-pruned like this in order to reduce the amount of times you have to prune them. And you really should try to prune them twice a year, not once a year. And the number of three to 9. You can take off the dead fronds. If they're over a courtyard or something where you don't want the seeds dropping, you can take the seed pods out, but not pruning many, if any, of the green fronds, and certainly not doing this poodle tailing. One of the things that a good friend of mine is Dr. Ed Gilman at the University of Florida. He's really internationally known as an urban forester and arboriculture professor. And he's done a lot of testing and research on structure and how it affects with wind. And, one of the things that he's developed a wind machine. I mean, it has like this 800 horsepower motor that and it has flaps on it. It's not just straight wind on the tree, but it actually does like a hurricane does. So he really is trying to figure out what can we do better for trees to keep them stronger in winds. And, it's so directly applicable to the Bahamas. But here's just an example of the same wind blast on 2 trees where reduction pruning and structural pruning was done on this tree and this one not. And it's pretty evident what happens in that situation. As you look, again, when we talked about central leader, here's the central leader. So you got a connection from the ground all the way to the top of the tree through one straight, doesn't have to be perfectly straight, but one connected structure versus multiple structures that come up that then, just creates weaker parts to the tree. And, that weaker part is really what becomes a failure point as the tree gets bigger. And, the term that they use most frequently is included bark. It can be codominant stems, but here's a good example of in the hurricanes that we saw come through South Florida, it became very evident that, we didn't have as many included bark trees as we had after the storms because they just failed. And they failed all over. And it didn't matter if it was West Indian mahoganies, gum elemies. I mean, it didn't matter which species. If they had that connection, they failed. And it was because if you look at 2 branches going up side by side, as they get bigger, they're basically forcing themselves apart, and it just gets weaker and weaker over time. So here's a typical branch bark connection. All branches have a collar. And so when you're going to do a pruning cut, and I have some more diagrams, but you basically want to be outside of that collar. If you flush cut, you're cutting into the stem that you're cutting from, and you're actually introducing decay into that branch into the future. Whereas if you're cutting outside of that collar, right through there, you're only taking that stem off and you're not affecting the trunk. And here's just codominant and a good example where really the best solution in this situation would be to pick one of those and take the other one off. More examples of that, just that, you can find them everywhere you go. That is such a key failure point. If there's one other thing you learn from this, it's, deal with codominant stems and those included bark connections. So in some cases, over pruning is problematic. In this case, they call the term they use for this is, lion tailing. And that's where you're just pruning everything up, and you see this a lot in shopping centers where people want to have more retail visibility, and they just over prune trees, and ultimately to be a problem. And this is just a good example that that notice the larger limbs closer to the ground. These lower limbs should have come off when this tree was younger to get that canopy up higher, because ultimately those limbs are going to get into that traffic way and have to come off. Except instead of coming off when they were an inch, now they're coming off when they're 6 inches or 12 inches in diameter. Significant. And of course, when you end up getting those big cuts, there's the result. You end up getting more decay into that tree, a weakening of that tree in the long term. Determining a pruning cycle. There's a lot of information available to that, but every every 1 to 2 years for smaller trees, for smaller pruning doses, and then higher doses every 3 to 5 years. This is, so every 1 or 2 years you should be pruning to help with that structure, where you're doing less damaging cuts on a more frequent basis. Here's a kind of a suggested pruning cycle. At planting you prune 2 to 3 years, 5 to 6, blah, blah, blah. Just continues on. Pruning tools. Obviously, you have to get the right tool for the right job. I mean, it's funny, the evolution of tools hasn't really changed that much in pruning trees. But one thing is that I'm ornery about, and I mean real ornery, with my forestry company and what we do with tree work, is keeping tools maintained, keeping them sharp, keeping a file, keeping them oiled. And biggest thing is this whole spread of disease and keeping them sanitized. And we use 1 part alcohol, just regular rubbing alcohol, to 9 parts water. That's our solution we use for sanitation. And it's very effective, and it just, with citrus problems in Florida, if you're pruning anything with fruits, I mean, I think it's very critical that you do those sanitation things. A couple quick things on just pruning cuts. This is called a reduction cut, where you're actually taking the limbs that are going up to reduce that canopy down. And then you have a removal cut, where you're cutting off the side, and it'll cause the plant to go up. It's really pretty straightforward. Making good pruning cuts. There's the couple great things here. Just that you do the first cut underneath, which causes, when you do the cut coming down, it doesn't rip the branch down. So you do the first cut here, second cut comes down. Now you've got a lightweight, and then you do your final cut. And you end up with just this very nice clean cut with no rips coming down, which just affects the main part of the tree. And there's just a good example, just some close-ups, some real photos. I mean, here you're cutting into that collar, too close to the stem. Here's where you want to be, just outside of that collar. And it really does, it does make a difference. There's a flush cut where it's been shut, and that kind of shows you what happens, and here's what happens with the injury. Pruning cuts are injury, but what trees do is they send callus cells out to seal off the injury. They don't heal. So if you hear that term, well, trees heal. No, they don't. They seal off the injury, so they send these warrior cells out to form that callus growth around that injury. And if you've done a good pruning cut, that callus growth around that pruning cut will be even all the way around and ultimately kind of close itself to seal it up. All right, quickly, Bahama mangroves. I've got 100 of these brochures that Todd Terrell and I worked together on to provide some guidance on mangrove pruning. And something, when you look at Florida, has a mangrove code that's I think 30 pages, ridiculously complex. I'm a certified professional mangrove trimmer, but it's way more than is needed. But boy, some simple guidance that allows a combination of retaining mangroves and framing those shoreline views are good. So anyway, red mangroves we know about, and I appreciated the talk that just happened. And of course, black mangroves with their nematophores. We have white mangroves, and of course, green and silver buttonwoods. The old forestry books called buttonwoods button mangroves. So they're really that much of a halophyte, that much of a salt-tolerant plant. So they grow in the same systems. So, prune mangroves are better than remove mangroves. So, anything you can do, if you're involved with projects, if you can help convince property owners, you don't have to lose your view. You don't affect your mooring. Everything can be done that you would do if you wiped it out, but you can do it and really retain that system along those edges. And it's, there's just successes all over of that. And you end up with views, these framed views that really allow, I think, for even an enhanced view over just a denuded shoreline. So, some basic things. These are in the flyer. I'm about out of time, but these are in the flyer that I'll hand out. But, obviously, trying to limit your amount of cutting on the mangrove to 25% any time you cut it. That keeps enough photosynthesis cooking on that plant to keep it healthy, and it does help. So, views, here's just not a great photo, but at least, gives you that view window that retains that mangrove shoreline. This is the brochure that'll be at the BNT table. And, obviously, as you look at these framed views looking out the house, I mean, to me, that is much more attractive than just a denuded shoreline. Quickly, International Society of Arboriculture. This is an international organization. I'd encourage anyone working with trees in the Bahamas to join this organization and look at that certified arborist program. I've been the president of the Florida chapter board for a couple years. I'm still on that board, very active with them, and it's it's a wonderful program that teaches you the basics of tree biology, tree science, and pruning, and the overall care of trees. So it's a great program that really can benefit anyone working on trees professionally. So anyway, great trees give back for a long time. These live oaks were planted by the Garden Club in this little community in Central Florida in 1883. It's pretty nice to know that these legacies live on well past your lifetime, your kid's lifetime. Of course, some trees are a little funkier pruning-wise. I love this. I found this Googling around, and here's, of course, the Prime Minister talked to us yesterday, but here he is. He's taking trees serious, and so I think here's where great trees really start. And don't you love that photo from Leon Levy? It gives you, you know something about that. And that's all I have.